Hi all, this is Fischer vs Spassky Game 6 from the 1972 World Championship match held in Reykjavik, Iceland. Fischer playing white shocked everyone in the world by playing c4. He had only on one or two occasions before played this move. One was a game against Polgiewski which ended up in a draw. So after c4, Spassky must have been quite shocked and a lot of the Russian preparation avoided. But anyway, Spassky played an opening he knew very well. In the Queens Gambit declined variation, he played his pet Tartakower variation, which is this b6 move here. Tartakower is very famous in chess for having a number of very witty and funny quotations. This system named after him is very solid, and black often prepares to fianchetto the queen's bishop. Fischer played c takes d5 here, and after knight takes d5, Fischer exchanged bishops off and plays knight takes d5. So we see some simplification here, and one of the points is that the black pawn on d5 is fixed, and it's going to be joined with another pawn very soon. Black will have hanging pawns now out of this opening, and this was all quite theoretical at the time. Fischer had kept up with the theory by reading Russian magazines, and bishop b5 now was played by Fischer, and after a6 the hanging pawns, and in particular this pin on the c diagonal, was exploited now by Fischer playing first d takes c5. And now Fischer leaves that bishop on b5. He doesn't need to move that. He just castles, and after rook a7 that pin is no longer true on the a pawn, so he retreats his bishop, and after knight d7 he now plays knight d4. So we see this diagonal pin being exploited now with this knight d4, and this is the start of Fischer gaining a slight advantage now out of the position, because after queen f8 there's a great little positional combination here. Fischer first plays knight takes e6, which is subtly, weakening black's pawn structure, because after this now Fischer sacrifices a pawn brilliantly with e4. So this pawn structure is really under fire now, especially because white has this potentially powerful, very powerful light squared bishop, to which black has no counterpart. And we see now black playing quite passively now with d4, just letting this bishop have a very powerful post on c4. But first, Fischer is careful not to give black any space in the centre with e5, which might help justify this plan. He first plays f4, and now after queen e7 Fischer gains further space, and further he fixes this pawn on the light square by playing e5. So this has been very nicely played positionally so far, with this target here and this target here for this light squared bishop. After rook b8 Fischer used that beautiful c4 square. Now in this position black cannot play knight b6 to chase that bishop from that outpost because of queen takes c5. Because if queen takes c5 then bishop e6 and recapturing the queen, big advantage to white. So this bishop is a real pain on c4, targeting this light squared pawn. So Spassky played king h8 here, and now Fischer magnificently sort of switched his attention to the king side with this queen h3 move. So you see this poor pawn being targeted, but also white's forces starting for a kingside attack here. Spassky just passively retreats that pawn knight to f8, and now Fischer consolidates his position on the queen side now by playing b3, and Spassky played a5. So here a4 would be tempting, just to cement that pawn on a5, but Fischer actually plays f5 with the idea of gaining a lot of pressure now on this f file, with the immediate threat also of f6, so he's not wasting any time with a4. Spassky took on f5, and we see rook f5. Now knight h7. Is this knight going to be useful later, coming to g5? Well, Fischer is not concerned. He just doubles rooks on the f file. And let's see, if knight g5, is there any knockout blow? Maybe not, but maybe queen d3 is an advantage for white, or just queen h5. And what is black doing? If queen h5, for example, h4 next, and the knight might be forced to move back. So Spassky's in a very passive position here. He plays actually queen d8, and Fischer now plays queen g3. So it's combining a light square attack now with a potentially dark square attack, with this queen being useful on this diagonal. And we see now that after rook e7, h4, Spassky really hasn't got a very good plan here. But Fischer increases his space with e6, and the queen is now coming to a very dominant central square here on e5. So Spassky's just forced into a very passive position. Previous to this game, he hasn't lost in this variation, this Tartakower variation. It's a very solid variation for black. So there's some shuffling around the time control. And now bishop d3. So what's going on here? Fischer's preparing a final assault on this light square diagonal now. The queen coming now to e4 with some menacing threats. Spassky now played knight f6, but it all looks to be very lost. My analytical assistant thinks that white is almost 5 pawns up here in computer terms. Spassky played knight f6, and now rook takes f6 was played, a very logical exchange sacrifice, shattering black's king position, immediately gaining 1 pawn for the exchange, but soon to be getting at least another or a mating attack. Spassky played here king g8, and Fischer has many roads to victory here. He has rook takes h6, for example, but actually what he played was bishop c4, and black's position still really hopeless here in this position, the exchange up for a pawn. His king's safety is just blown to pieces. After king h8, Fischer now played queen f4, and it's actually a forced mate according to my analytical assistant, whatever black does. Spassky here resigned, but let's have a look at an example continuation. Queen g8, say, queen e5, rook h7, e7, and it's just all over. You know, multiple threats, the pawn, the bishop, double checks. So in this position, Spassky had resigned. Let's have a quick overview and summary of the game. Fischer playing unusually c4, so we get a Queens Gambit declined transposition, the Tartakower variation with b6. We see now out of the opening we get these hanging pawns. Fischer had tempted weaknesses as well with a6 with this bishop to b5 move, and now we see the hanging pawns being exploited with this diagonal pin, and a beautiful positional combination now to blast open these light squares and fix this pawn on e6 with this f4 and e5 plan. Now Fischer turns his attention to the king side, puts a lot of pressure on the f file with doubling the rooks. The queen comes back to the centre now with a menacing position, and finally we see a beautiful combination with rook takes f6, exchange sacrifice for a pawn, and a winning attack to which there's no defence after queen f4. A brilliant game. 1,500 spectators applauded. Spassky also applauded Fischer, which Fischer was very honoured by, and this was one of the greatest games in the 1972 World Championship match played in Reykjavik, Iceland. An excellently played game by Fischer.